Hello everyone. Today's topic is server-side rendering versus static site generation. First things first, let's start with some definitions of what these two categories are. Probably the best way to start thinking about server-side rendering is to look at its history. If you go back to sometime after 2010, you started to see these frameworks, single-page application frameworks starting to show up. Initially, that was things like Backbone, then it led to Ember and Angular. Now we have React and Vue. But in any case, they became very popular, and they're popular for a good reason, which is that they, once loaded, are very fast. And also the frameworks tended to help with having an opinion that helped people build more complex applications that were there before. So that was the good side, but there was a problem. There was no SEO. You could go to any page in the app, but all you got was a tiny little bit of HTML that pointed to JavaScript. The actual content of the page just wasn't there. There were other problems as well. The first time to interactive was quite slow because you were needing to load up all the JavaScript from the network and then parse it before you could actually do anything on the page. So this really was the origin of SSR, and it led to projects like Fastboot in the Ember community, Next in the React community, Nux in the Vue community. I'm sure there's something in Angular, but I'm not familiar with what it is. Effectively, everyone realized you have to have SEO, and it would be a whole lot better if the page were to boot up faster. So far, in our definition of SSR, we have actually not defined it. To me, the SSR definition first is that you can go to, with the browser, go to a page and get the full HTML content, and then it hydrates into the SPA. So at that point forward, you're getting the normal kind of SPA responsiveness. The other side of this is that if you have a client like a web crawler that doesn't use JavaScript, then all pages, deep linked, or just navigated through, can be served over HTML. It's important to note, however, that the architectures that are needed to support an SPA are not the same as what's required for server-side rendering. And that will become important as we start to talk about how does server-side rendering compare to static site generation. So let's quickly take a look. Here you see the SPA architecture, and it's quite straightforward actually. You just have clients from around the world who are going to a CDN. The CDN is very inexpensive and it allows for low latency, and then it just picks up an indexed HTML file. So regardless of where you're going, what page you're going to, that indexed HTML will load up the application and display all of the different pages. Now let's compare that to the SSR. On the SSR, there's some similarity. We still have the JavaScript, the images, and CSS all sitting out on a CDN. However, there's an important addition, and that is we need to have a server now. Now you may say, servers aren't the worst thing in the world, but let's wait and have the conversation when we look at the static site generation in comparison to SSR. Probably at roughly the same time as the single-page applications were really starting to take off, you saw another movement kind of almost in the opposite direction, where people were reacting to the amount of JavaScript that was being written and saying, let's get back to basics. We recognize we don't want a brochureware websites. We want some dynamic activity, but can't we just rely on HTML and CSS? So that's where you see products like Jekyll, Hugo, Hexo cropping up and getting pretty big adoption, primarily for kind of a technical audience. And I think the strongest use case that we saw was for building blogs. However, definitely there are many more use cases for them, but they allowed for you to take semi-static data, like a blog post, and inject it into the Git repo in a timely manner, allowing for a dynamic-like website, but only serving out HTML and CSS. From that origin, we now have what I'm categorizing as Generation 2 and Generation 3 static site generators, and it doesn't follow that generation 2 and 3, or the products that basically provide that functionality, they necessarily became available in a sequential order. It's more distinguishing the kind of functional focus between these sets of products. In generation 2, you have a key distinction that separates from generation 1, and that is that all of the static site generators will ultimately hydrate into a single page application. So in the case of Gatsby, that's to React. In the case of GridSim or ViewPress, that's both of those are to Vue. One of the really nice benefits of this, of course, is that you now have access to all the component libraries that you are already familiar with when it comes to whatever your SPA framework of choice is. So you get the benefit of the static generation on the build side, and then when you get to the browser, you then get the benefit of all the components and framework and hooks that come with your single page application. Now, when we get to generation 3, the products that are kind of representing that level of functionality are Next to Nux, and that might be a little bit surprising to some of you because obviously those are products that are typically associated with server-side rendering. However, as it turns out, the process of server-side rendering actually sets you up very well to do static site generation as well. In order to understand what new functionality comes into generation 3, we need to explore in a little bit more detail what static data means. Static data doesn't mean purely static data. If it were static, you just put it in the HTML. However, it means data that is not near real time. So it is something that is moving at a relatively slow pace. And where that line is drawn really is up to you. There's a lot of context of the application that's required to decide that. In generation 1 and 2, we have an assumption that the data is relatively slow and that the data that is relatively slow will not be managed by the hydrated SPA client. So you generate the content that is quote-unquote static data in generation 1 and 2, and then when you get up to the browser and you're operating there, you never change that same content. That's where generation 3 is different. In a generation 3 solution, you are given certain primitives or hooks that allow you to bring in data, and that hook then gets called both on the server side and the client side. This is super useful. It means that you can write code once and have certain data types that are both generated and then managed again on the client side. So let's use a code example. This example is using the Nuxt framework on top of Vue.js. So now there is a hook that Nuxt brings in called async data. Basically what this allows is that whenever you go to a page or a component is instantiated, then you will call the async data method. That is then run both on the client and the server, and you'll also notice that we are able to use the store. The store is using Vuex. If you're familiar, if you're in the React land, you're probably talking about Redux. But basically, there is a client-side state management tool called Vuex, but that package is also available on the server and the client. So what I'm able to do is basically load up the Vuex store, and then this page is using the state, and that state exists when you generate the page, so all the HTML will be generated, but it also exists when the client hydrates as a PWA, and therefore all that data is available in a structured form in the Vuex store on the client side, not just as HTML that's been generated during the static generation process. So the implications of this are quite important. So in generation 3, you're able to take any data type generate it on the server side, but also utilize it in a structured manner on the client side. So this opens up possibilities such as, let's imagine that you have a product catalog, but the product catalog is based on what users logged in and what geography that user's in. So in that case, you'd probably just defer that, as being a non-statically generated item for generation 1 and 2. It needs to be managed on the client and basically is going to react to or respond to that user and what geography they care about. However, the SEO of the catalog, the catalog is probably a very big representation of what that application is about. So why not generate the catalog for a couple of areas, indiscriminate of who the user is, and then when the user comes in, if they're in one of those areas, great, it's already been statically generated. And in all other cases, it then uses the API on the client side to build out the catalog that way. So you're getting an opportunity to take a much wider range of data and statically generate, and then also manage it where it's appropriate on the client side. Okay, now we've talked about server-side rendering and static site generation, but this is really a video about one versus the other. So let's talk about that first through the vantage point of what these two things are trying to achieve. Okay, so let's start with SSR. If you remember, SEO was kind of a big item, probably the big item. But interestingly, SSG also provides SEO. Then let's take a look at SSR, first time to interactive. Indeed, definitely SSR achieves that goal, but so does SSG, and possibly even a little bit faster. Then having people who don't use JavaScript to be able to navigate to the different pages. Yes for SSR, also yes for SSG. Now, SSR also responds to the user agent. Wait a second, I don't remember talking about that one. And the reason is that it definitely isn't one of the things that got people building SSR solutions. However, it is something that sometimes people do. So for instance, when let's say I come to a site with SSR, the server running process is able to detect, what browser am I using? So maybe I will only push up the polyfills that are needed for my browser. Potentially also some indication as to my geography. There may be things along the either user agent or other headers that are passed along that I can respond to in a dynamic fashion. Is that available in SSG? It is not. Okay, now let's turn our attention to static site generation and the goals it set out to achieve. Obviously, as we've already talked about, most of the goals have already been discussed, and they're the same as what you get with server-side rendering. However, there's one other goal that was talked about, and that is keeping things simple, specifically creating static assets and just static assets and shipping those out through a CDN. And yep, SSG does achieve that goal, and no, SSR does not. So if we just roll up to the 10,000 feet, we can see that both SSR and SSG achieve a lot of goals which are worth reaching out to. However, they both do it, and the only deltas are those highlighted here. So in server-side rendering, you obviously have a server process that's being hit whenever you come into the application, and therefore you have the ability to respond to the user agent in some fashion. With SSG, you have a much simpler, all the assets that you're deploying are static. You get to utilize fully the CDN, therefore you will achieve lower latency, you will achieve slightly higher performance, and you will not have any server costs. For me, comparing those two benefits, the benefits on the static site generation side are substantially greater. From a what we achieve standpoint, I've weighed in and said that I think static site generation has got advantages over server-side rendering. But we can't ignore complexity. Complexity translates into cost, and therefore maybe static site generation, in terms of taking the value out of it is much more complex. So we're going to explore that. We're going to look at the flow, the process flow of what is involved in both, and then we'll make a judgment on which of the two is more complex. Okay, there's a lot of details here, but this is meant to represent the server-side rendering flow. Let's zoom in a little bit and start at the left-hand side. On the left is just meant to represent the different types of static data that might live in a solution that you're building. Data might obviously come from a database, and in fact, a number of the headless CMSs that might be involved in this space might have a database connected through an API. You might be pulling from your transactional database. Maybe you're pulling up aggregated data from a data warehouse. Then you also might just have a bunch of markdown files. This is very common for kind of the blog model. Static site generators like ViewPress rely heavily on writing documentation in Markdown and having it converted into HTML during the static generation file. But there's a variety of things. It may be just one thing that you're drawing from, one data source. It may be multiple. Then we move over to the right and we look at design time. So in a server-side rendering application, you are building a template that talks to the structure of the pages in your application. Could be HTML. It more likely is some sort of a templating language like Pug or Handlebars. There's quite a few of them. And then you're writing your code in JavaScript, potentially TypeScript, styling, CSS, Sass, so on and so forth. There's a bunch of configuration required. Okay, the next step in the process is the build process. It's a big one, so I'm going to break it up into two parts. On the left-hand side, there's just the basic transpilation that we've all gotten used to in this modern era of JavaScript. So it almost surely involves transpiling from the source code that you've written down to something that the browser can run, whether that's using Babel or TypeScript compiler, it doesn't matter. And then there's a bunch of other items here. These are all things that you'd expect to see in a modern pipeline, and for the most part, the tools that we use today pretty much add those in, or they can be added in with optional add-ons. So that's not the more interesting part. Let's move to the right. This is where we start to talk about the build process, which relates more to the server-side rendering. Now, while I did just say that this is the more interesting part, I have to admit that most of it is empty. There will be more sections when we get to static generation. But what you see here is that in the SSR process, we need to take all of the HTML content that comes from our various routes that we've configured and basically take that HTML and put it into a JavaScript format so that on the server side, it can display all the different HTML pages by putting in this kind of hydrated JavaScript object. From here, we're ready to look at what is actually deployed, and with the server-side rendering, we have two deployments. One is on the top box there, you have the client side. That's basically the content which gets put into the CDN and then is highly available to your application. Down below is the server side. Effectively, it's just a JavaScript file with a number of resources. Exactly how those resources are structured might vary based on which framework you're using. I've demonstrated what you'd get with Nuxt, and in that case you have a HTML template for the SPA and HTML template for the server-side renderer. You have all that hydrated JS stuff that we talked about in the build process, and a whole bunch more. So basically we have all the resources that the server needs to quickly generate HTML pages for the initial load and then hydrate it over to the SPA. So finally at runtime, we load the HTML, we hydrate it to an SPA. We can then load up the client state. So if you're using Vue, you might use Vuex to load up the client state. And you may also decide to cache a bunch of information in a service worker or maybe just IndexedDB. That's a whole nother topic. The only thing I'll point out on this runtime area is that the client state, it was mentioned earlier that one of the nice things about a framework like Nuxt, Next, so on, is that you can use the same code to set your client state that you'd use to set your server state. Now what we're going to do is bring in static site generation and look at its flow. But hopefully the first thing you notice is that there's a lot of similarity. So rather than go through each intricate detail, the only thing we need to do in this case is really just cover the differences. First things first, let's get rid of the static data section. That is completely the same. We can do the same thing on the runtime section. The design time section, we can get rid of everything but configure. Now you'll notice that actually the text is exactly the same, but there is a tiny little thing that is at least recommended in the static site generation that because you have to generate dynamic routes, you then need to tell the build system what dynamic routes will be generated. So for instance, you have the index of all blog posts that will generate without any additional configuration. However, if you want to generate the detailed of the last 10 blog posts, you'll need to specify what the IDs are for those 10. So that is a configuration item that is not required in server-side rendering because it can be done at the point of request, but in generation, you must add that in. It's really quite minor. Within the build system, we really only have to pay attention to the right-hand side. And there, it's basically the static generation process has 3 new items. So the first one is being able to generate the SPA routes from the router configuration. Same goes for dynamic routes, and then generate the actual HTML. So those 3 things are sort of happening in the SSR side as well. But the logic for that is getting embedded into the server process in the SSR, whereas here you're basically embedding it largely into the HTML files. Now the last section is just to look at the deploy area, and in a way this is not really surprising. We knew that the server-side rendering required a server process, and static site generation does not. In addition, the static site generation, because it doesn't have the generation of the rendering function, it does need to have HTML. So it will have an HTML file for every route that it knows about. That includes both the static routes and the dynamic routes. Okay, let's bring this plane back up to 10,000 feet and just talk about what we've learned. We know that server-side rendering and static site generation have some valuable benefits that are worth having. We also know that tools like Next and Nux do both. We also know that generation is slightly faster, costs less, and has less operational risk because there is no computational layer. From a level of effort or complexity standpoint, both of them add a little bit of complexity over their SPA counterparts. However, with modern tooling, neither of them are overbearing, and both of them are about the same. It's based on this thinking that we have chosen static site generation as a tool over server-side rendering in all situations where performance is paramount and where SEO matters, aka any application that has an end consumer audience. Please remember that all opinions on this video are mine, and while I'm a big fan of my opinions, I am often wrong, so please feel free to contribute your thoughts. If I missed something, let me know. If you think that I got something wrong, that's also fair game, and I hope to hear from you soon.